Martin Kettle from The Guardian. Anthony, you didn't say anything about party, and all Prime Ministers have to deal with their parties.
Yeah.
And the Labour Party is different from the Tory Party, and a coalition is different from a single party. And I just wondered if what you could say on that subject, since it's so important for so many Prime Ministers and has brought so many of them down.
Martin, I mentioned party as something that your team in number 10 need to manage for you. I think it's very difficult if the Prime Minister, even a Labour Prime Minister, is going to be, and as we know, Conservative parties have been much unkinder to their political leaders, hacking them down with much greater regularity than the Labour Party with its own leaders. But Labour Prime Ministers have particular problems managing their party. I think if they themselves give too much personal time and too much personal investment in it, they cheapen themselves and lose direction. So I think for the next Labour Prime Minister, who knows, could be in office in 2020, to get the party appropriately there. Blair gave very little attention to the party, as you know very well, yet still managed to win as a Labour Prime Minister 3 general elections as Labour's most successful political leader in history, Prime Minister in history. So yes, it's important, but get the strategy right with your party and then let other people handle the relations and go to the speeches and give the speeches, but don't give too much time, I would say, is the case. So when Jeremy Corbyn becomes Prime Minister in 2020, pause, no reaction, he would be well to get his governing strategy right, his statecraft right, and let other people do the engine room work on the Labour Party and the brothers and sisters.
Thank you. Next one, here on the other.
Yes. I suspect being Prime Minister is fundamentally the same as working in any large organisation if you're CEO of a very large company. And as an accountant, I've observed some of these people in action. And I've seen organizations that quickly become very dysfunctional. People are always falling out with each other, relationships are breaking down. And the other thing I found is you sometimes get a CEO who is very impulsive. He gets an idea inside his brain, and it becomes an obsession very quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, there have been Prime Ministers like that, like Margaret Thatcher with the poll tax, Anthony Eden with Nasser. And
will you forgive me for asking if we could make it a question?
Yeah.
We've got an awful lot of
do you think that's a big problem, that people's psychological profile, some people are very decisive without being impulsive.
Okay.
And you've got to work it out.
Would you like to say your name as well?
Yes, Hugh Edwards.
Thank you.
Hugh, two very quick points on that, and I'm agreeing with both of you, with both points. That clearly a Prime Minister, like a Chief Executive, who falls out with people. Gordon Brown fell out badly with people, so did Harold Wilson, so did Margaret Thatcher towards the end. You cannot do that and survive, because the story, anything that happens in secret in number 10 in the morning will be in the Evening Standard by the afternoon. I remember, it's now public, Robin Butler saying to me when he was Cabinet Secretary, no one says anything in Cabinet anymore because they know it's going to be on the first, and there's one of the Cabinet Ministers there, Virginia Bottomley, at the time, because it will be, somebody's going to leak it. You can't have rows and keep them secret, and it's undignified to read about it, and because the media loves the rows and magnifies it, and then there's come back and you've lost the plot. And being capricious was another point I was saying. You mustn't be capricious, don't meddle, was one of the key things as a Prime Minister, and there are many things that you're going to have to just swallow. You have to have that bigness of character to see the anger and the irritation and the humiliation and the denigration rise and fall and not act on it, and not come in with random ideas, whether they are dogs on leads or endless examples. So very similar, but also I have to say massive differences, not just with accountancy, but also with running private companies. But we can maybe talk about that if there's more questions.
Let's go right to the back, and then I'm coming. There's a whole lot at the front.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Alan Evans, Chief Executive of the British Academy. Interestingly, perhaps not surprisingly, one phrase I don't think you used at all in your talk was the phrase Deputy Prime Minister.
Yeah.
And since the war, there have been times when we've had them, good or bad, and not at all. And I just wonder what your perspective is on the value or otherwise of having them. My own view, for what it's worth, is that if you do have a Deputy Prime Minister, it has to be a clear remit with role and responsibilities, and at the moment it seems to me the one area where one could have a Deputy Prime Minister is have one responsible for the nations and the regions of the United Kingdom where there's clear risk to the future of the United Kingdom.
Yeah, very interesting question there, and thank you very much for that. They couldn't use the title Deputy Prime Minister, although Eden did, because it before 1957-63, because it would have preempted the sovereign's right to select the successor as Prime Minister. And if the Prime Minister is too open about it, it's going to create problems for the succession. The Prime Minister has to stand aloof from their successor, otherwise they are going to be identified with one faction or another. So let's come off the name and the function. I mentioned that you need to have a cabinet, a head prefect and cabinet, absolutely essential. Willie Whitelaw was perhaps the best example, and it is surely instructive that when he left in, was it 87 or was it 88? Was it January 88? January 88, someone will know the answer. Here, 2.5 years before the end, she declined. You need that fixer. So I think that's definitely a role there. You need also to have somebody who's going to be a very honest person. I didn't talk about the spouse. Having a strong spouse is very effective, not a spouse. In December 1954, somebody died who changed the face of the country. That person was Sidney Courtauld, married to Rab Butler. Sidney Courtauld would constantly pick him up and criticise him, and having that indulgent, self-indulgent character that he has, I can think of other politicians at the moment who need to have critical wives who will bring you down, rather than Molly, who he married, a delightful woman, but buffed him up all the time and said, Rab, you really should be leader. And so you need the critical friend very close to you in that role. You need somebody fixing cabinet for you, but you can't be too closely identified with the person who's going to succeed you for the reasons I said around factions. There's so many. All these questions could be much longer asked. I'm thinking of lots of things I could have said to Martin and earlier on too. I'm aware that the answers are necessarily brief, and please forgive me for that.
Great. Right here in the front.
Yes, I can hear. Sorry.
Christina Dykes. I'm an associate at the Institute for Government, and I'm one of your students, but we can talk about that another time. I agree with you about relationships. My question is, do you think that hubris gets them in the end, putting them beyond empathy and the ability to make constructive relationships?
Great. So what university is that, Christina?
Buckingham.
Oh, marvellous. Sorry, I just wanted to have that. University of Buckingham. Very good. So, hubris can get us all in the end. We all know the Roman emperors. What was whispered in the ear of Roman emperors? What? Shouted out somebody?
You are mortal.
You are mortal. I'm looking for the Latin, but that will do. You are mortal. We need somebody, whether it's Sidney Courtauld figure who is going to, because it is such an unreal life to be Prime Minister, to go off and be in the Oval Office and then in Turkey and then back. It is such, you need to be psychologically very, very grounded and secured, and many of them are not. Many of them do not have that, and therefore you tend to believe, we all tend to believe that, don't we? And the wisest people in my life that I've met are always those who have true humility. And very few prime ministers have humility, because that's not a particular quality that qualifies you to getting up there in the first place. So how you manage that, but hubris will bring you down. It did with Thatcher, the poll tax. Europe lost touch, became more and more isolated, was seeing the world through the prism of what Bernard Ingham gave her on the Daily Press Digest, and then had a disastrous post. Actually, I'm going to go careful. She was Chancellor at the University of Buckingham. She didn't have the happiest, is actually what I meant to say, post-premierships, and broke one of the rules, which is to belittle her successor, which did nothing for her other than lose her dignity and credibility. So hubris, absolutely. And how do you avoid it? You avoid it by having people close to you who all the time are bringing you down to the ground. The problem is that many people round the Prime Minister themselves get swept up in that bubble, and I'm afraid to say that's what happened. Much though I like and admire them to David Cameron's team, and they were not seeing reality. The reality that they were seeing as they were going in to fight that referendum campaign was not the reality and I'm sure all of us in this room were thinking. They can now begin to see it, how differently they could have fought that campaign, and then reform the EU from the inside. Yep.
Thanks. Here, just behind the camera, I'm coming over here and over here.
Thank you. Peter Unwin from the Whitehall and Industry Group. Your analysis is that often, if not for the most part, Prime Ministers haven't worked well with the civil service and indeed their Cabinet Secretaries. What advice would you give to the civil service and the Cabinet Secretary to make that less likely to happen?
Well, they are the tragedy about Robin Butler and Richard Wilson, Andrew Turnbull, is they really tried to understand what the Prime Minister wanted. And that is fundamental. The civil servants, I needn't remind anyone in this room, are not elected. In our unwritten constitution, they are there to serve, to advise and to dispose of, execute government policy. And that if you now on Brexit, the Whitehall has to simply lump it and get on with it and be optimistic about it, because if you start saying it's going to take 10 years to sort it all out, it's all going to be terrible, it will take 10 years and it will be much harder if one's optimistic about it. What we think is what happens. So they need to be absolutely loyal, to be feisty on their advice, and to be very, very honest. And the best civil servants, as you will know, are not the yes people. Wilson fell down by having Michael Halls, who Wilson, as you know, had a fear of the distrust of the Treasury, so wanted to have somebody who he knew from the Board of Trade, who he'd known when he was junior minister, when he was Board of Trade president at the end of Attlee, so Board of Trade liked that person. You cannot have yes people. You've got to have the best civil servants, fewer, better more recently than the much-loved Chris Martin, who died at the age of 42, Principal Private Secretary to the PM in between Jeremy Hayward, though Jeremy Hayward was called Perm Sec at the time, and Chris was called Director General, and Simon Case, who's now getting that most wonderful of all jobs. Chris was very frank, to be very frank, but then to do what they want, because they are the elected government, and you have to do what they want. So that's the advice. And I think we have an extraordinary civil service who seem to have very little friends and very few people to stand up and support them. And of course, the trap is the civil service can't do it itself.
Right here.
Well, as always, Anthony, I passionately agree with all your 20 points, and particularly about the civil service and speaking truth under power and the importance of the Institute for Government. Can I offer two questions for your thought? One is that the comparison with the commercial world. Yes, the commercial world, leaders you want tenacity, excellent relationship managers, a sort of optimism, and of course ability. But they can pick their own team. The problem in the political world, you have to put up with the bastards around you, and they're all jealous of you. So I think that which is underestimated in the political world is everybody wants your job, and most of them think they would have got it better. So at least in the States, maybe, you can pick your own team. The other, just metaphor for your thoughts, I used to think it was like those cards you see at the fun fair with the ducks that go round, and they shoot at the ducks, and in the end, they've got you. All the ducks are off, then they take that card down, and along comes somebody else. But there's something about a critical mass of U-turns and failures and disasters. Right, off with you and in with somebody else.
Okay, just for the record, would you like to say your name?
Virginia Bottomley. I used to dabble in some of these things rather unsuccessfully.
Indeed. Thanks.
Okay, so thank you for that, Virginia. And Virginia is chair of a headhunter and will know, thus an enormous amount, not just about the political world, from a cabinet minister, but also the commercial world too. But you say that the Prime Minister can't choose the people around the cabinet table, but they can choose to lead them better or worse. And they cannot be friends. They have to be always in tune with and understanding what the Prime Minister wants, and part of the genius of a successful Prime Minister is to carry the cabinet, to lead them so that they are following, not getting too far out ahead, and not also just being a first amongst equals, just taking the lowest common denominator point. So that's the skill, as we all know, the skill of building a team is leading people and taking them as far as you can get and at the right speed that you can get, and having that person as the chief fixer being your head prefect with them. And then you can get them doing pretty much what you want, because they know that they're going to succeed by doing well in their departments. They're all ambitious, nothing wrong with that, but their ambition should make them, therefore, align with what the Prime Minister wants. And if cabinet, it's a cabinet secretary. We have a cabinet government system. It works best when the prime ministers, it's what went wrong with Blair, that's what went wrong with Thatcher at the end, fail to remember that we have a cabinet office, cabinet secretaries, that we have a cabinet government system. You have to keep the cabinet with you on side, and you can only, and then if somebody goes off on their own particular thing that the cabinet don't agree with, then you just get rid of them, or if they're incompetent, you get rid of them, or if they are caught with their trousers down, you get, metaphorically, you get rid of them. Quickly, sharply, so everyone knows who is the boss, knows what the norms of behaviour, what is acceptable. And yes, lots of similarities, lots of differences there. Virginia, yes, you come back at me there because you're not...
My point is, when you sack them, they go onto the back benches and make trouble for you. So in the commercial world, you pay them off and you never see them again. But in the political world, they go and chair the select committee. They put down an early day motion. They never get off your back. That's what I meant.
Yes, and it's difficult. And no one is pretending that the job of being a Prime Minister is easy. But you can manage it better or worse. And there are some people who you simply have to sack, and they will go on and chair the select committee, and they'll be on Newsnight all the time and on the Today programme, and doesn't the media outlets love to hear what they have to say, and don't they give them so much space and time to do that, and it's galling, but you have to rise above that, and you have to act on the principles that you have held to. The Prime Minister without principles is a captain of a ship without any port to sail towards, and people have to know that. Next question.
And it's going to have to be the last one. I'm incredibly sorry, just over here. I'm sorry.
Sorry, David Hannay, House of Lords. Two very short ones. One, you said nothing about whether or not Prime Ministers should aim to stay on beyond a certain length of time, but all your examples show that they went into decline beyond a fairly short period.
Yes.
Secondly, you state as a fact, which I think you're right, that the Prime Minister has to effectively be Foreign Secretary. You've not faced up to the fact that because she does that, she's actually incapable of fulfilling most of your precepts and incapable of avoiding most of your mistakes, because it is the amount of time that is spent going to summits, going around like last week, which actually makes it almost impossible to do all the other things you said he or she should do?
Okay, so two very important points from Lord Hannay, as one would expect from one of the nation's greatest diplomats. Longevity is a topic I didn't talk about. I think many prime ministers have become prime minister too young, and some have become prime ministers too old. Who would I select in the post-war prime ministers who we principally, but not exclusively, been talking about today? I think that Blair became prime minister too young. He hadn't worked out what he wanted to do. He thought running the country would be like running the Labour Party, turning around the country would be like creating new Labour. He had not learnt wisdom, which is a much undervalued topic. And I think Cameron, the youngest Prime Minister for 198 years, forming an extraordinarily close relationship with the youngest Chancellor of the Exchequer for 120 years in George Osborne, were too young. He would have been a better. Another point that I was made answer to Bronwen's question is, he'd learnt how to do it. Tony Blair had learnt much more by his 7th, 8th year how to be Prime Minister than he did early on. Some were too old. Eden was too old and ill. He'd had the bowel duct operation in 1953. I think Macmillan was too old. I think Callaghan was too old. We remember Wilson's famous joke about, there weren't too many of his jokes, about leaving to make way for the older man in Callaghan. So I think there is an ideal age where you are still robust enough but wise enough to do the job effectively, but not too old that infirmity takes the better part of your premiership, because pacing yourself is absolutely critical and key. And longevity, they would love to leave at moments of their own choosing. That was David Cameron's, one of his greatest hopes and joys was choosing that moment. And it was such a clever thing to say in the 2015 election that he was, the media banged him for it. It was such a clever thing to say he wasn't going to fight another general election. He wasn't. He would have gone in 2018 at a moment of his own choosing. And much would have been made of the fact that he, was leaving a strong country and not being forced out, as they all have apart from that. And Wilson was really forced out by what his doctors were telling him about his state of physical health rather than his political colleagues. So longevity, I think the ideal length is probably 7 years. It's very hard to stay longer, but very few have had the luxury of that length of time. The longest Prime Minister of all, you all know, is, we've had 54, the youngest, Walpole, and Walpole was Prime Minister for 20 years, 321 days, without wanting to be too precise about it. Wouldn't happen now, and the successor 53 have all been shorter periods. And then, David, your point there about being Foreign Secretary, yes, but what else can they do? Yes, it's hard, because I think, as I said, you can't be Chancellor of the Exchequer, you've got to, however, be effectively Foreign Secretary and half head of state. You've got to do these things, and they are far more physically draining. I mean, her head will be buzzing this week. She will be disorientated. I don't know if there are any doctors here, but doctors will say all kinds of things about her state of physical and mental alertness and receptivity following those very long flights and dislocation of sleep patterns. And it is absolutely, as you know, totally draining. But what else can the Prime Minister do? And that's why I'm saying that they need to shovel off a lot of things onto other people, including party management, including management of policy and presentation, and not make yourself... there's so much of a boxer in every Prime Minister. They all come to the steps in a lachrymose way at the beginning, talk about St. Francis or talking about healing the nation. I'm not remotely cynical about that. I mean, Margaret Thatcher, was very sincere. They're all very sincere. They are deeply humble and touched when they take over and have these very ideas, and they want to become like Boxer and Animal Farm. They just think it's not going well enough. They're going to work even harder, and it kills them. Some literally. But I don't think, David, that there is any other alternative but for the Prime Minister to play that role in foreign policy, but to be very selective about what it is that they're doing. And at least, finishing on a bright note, one good thing about coming out of the EU when we do is that they won't have to go to all those darned EU councils. Thank you all very much. And talking about duration, I think I've used up my duration.
Yes, I'm going to ask you one final question, though, as you've nicely taken us on to foreign policy, and it is simply to ask whether you think that the 10 points that you've set out there, as you said, might apply to chief executives, but whether you think they apply to running many other countries as well, for example, the United States, and indeed whether you think our Prime Minister is handling the new occupant of the Oval Office as best she might.
Well, I think it is a typical, it's a glaring example, Bronwen, of what happens to somebody in the limelight where there is no right answer. Is it better if there's someone we find odious to cut them off altogether and say we're going to have nothing to do with you, or is it better to befriend them and try and influence them round to your way of thinking?
Which, for example, William Hague has argued this morning in the Telegraph.
Right, which I haven't seen. That is what I think, and I think that if one dislikes that and one's been in the civil service and government service, it's probably better to be circumspect and to make those your points behind the walls rather than out in open. I'm not certain it's necessarily wise or helpful to the country. I think myself that she has to befriend him. However, I find it hard to find much in him. But I think that I would like, but I think she has to do this because she has a real chance. Who else in the world is going to outside, much though many wise people within the US belittle the special relationship, belittle foreign countries, who else could have the potential to school him, educate him, teach him about governance and about civility and about good diplomacy and good neighbourly relations, not the least with NATO. So I think she had to do it. Of course she's going to get zapped. Whatever she did, she would have got zapped. You know that is going to happen to you as Prime Minister. You simply have to be big enough to take it. And I think now she's got the country. Of course it's difficult for the head of state, but the head of state knows that also. And everyone knows the head of state is brought into these moments in the Queen's long reign where this has happened. I think that now actually the person who holds the whip hand is the Prime Minister, because if in confidence she makes it clear to him that if he does certain things, that invitation will be rescinded. It puts her in an extraordinarily powerful position. As long as it's all done diplomatically behind the scenes, she has a very powerful weapon, because to withdraw that invitation if he does something that is grossly injurious gives real power and authority to her and to Britain. And I think personally, whatever we might think of Trump, whatever we do think of him, undoubtedly we think very differently, she, by being close to him, I think will be serving Britain's interests best. I didn't support Brexit, but we've got Brexit, so let's make the best of it now. That's the reality. For Britain now, I think it's best for America that she does that, and I think it's best for the world that she takes the policy line that she has.
Anthony, thank you very much. Can you join me in thanking Sir Anthony Seldon?